There is a parking ticket in a brown manila envelope inside NYPD evidence locker in Brooklyn. The envelope is labeled File 4-77-2244. The ticket itself is yellowed now, its carbon copy faded to the color of old tea. It was written at 2:30 in the morning on July 31st, 1977. The fine was $35. The car was a cream-colored 1970 Ford Galaxy. The owner of that car had just walked half a block down a dark Brooklyn street and shot two young people sitting in a parked vehicle. He was, at that moment, the most feared man in the United States. The newspapers called him the Son of Sam. The man writing him a ticket for parking too close to a fire hydrant did not know any of this. He just saw a hydrant. He saw a car. He wrote the ticket. He moved on. That ticket ended a 13-month reign of terror that had paralyzed a city of 8 million people. 300 detectives, federal task forces, psychic mediums brought in by desperate captains, profilers, geographers, handwriting analysts. None of them caught David Berkowitz. A parking ticket caught David Berkowitz. $35, written by a meter cop who finished his shift, drove home, and went to sleep without any idea what he had just done. My name is Blackwell. I keep these things. I keep the original ticket, sealed in a glassine sleeve. I keep the carbon copy, the duplicate filed at the precinct, and the third copy that was supposed to be mailed to the owner of the Cream Galaxy at his home address in Yonkers. That third copy was the one that mattered. That third copy was the kind of small, boring piece of paper that, if you trace its journey carefully, becomes the most important document of the summer of 1977. Tonight, I am going to walk you through 6 of those documents. 6 accidents. 6 men who built empires of fear, who eluded entire federal agencies for years, sometimes decades, who taunted detectives, mocked profilers, and outran every form of investigative brilliance the American legal system could throw at them. And every single one of them was brought down not by genius, not by a hunch, not by a lucky break in interrogation. Each one was brought down by a piece of paper, a missing license plate, a floppy disk, a sentence that sounded familiar to a brother, a website, a posture in a parking lot. The myth of the brilliant detective is one of the great frauds of modern crime writing. The truth is much smaller and much darker. The truth is that almost every legendary criminal is caught because he made a small, stupid, household-level mistake that any teenager could have avoided. The truth is that arrogance is the loudest sound a killer makes, and the universe always hears it. 6 killers, 6 accidents. Let us begin where I began. Let us begin with the parking ticket. David Richard Berkowitz was born on June 1st, 1953 in Brooklyn, New York. He was placed for adoption almost immediately and raised by Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a hardware store owner and his wife in the Bronx. Pearl died of breast cancer when David was 14. He took the loss the way certain children do, which is to say, he absorbed it without showing anyone, and over the following years, that absence rotted him quietly. He served briefly in the United States Army. He drifted through jobs. By 1976, he was working as a letter sorter at a postal facility in the Bronx, living alone in a small apartment in Yonkers, sleeping with a high-powered handgun under his pillow, and writing letters to his neighbors about a dog he believed was telling him to kill. The dog belonged to a man named Sam Carr who lived nearby. The dog was a Labrador. Berkowitz believed the dog was possessed by a 6,000-year-old demon and that Sam Carr was the human vessel of this demon. He believed the demon ordered him, through the dog, to find young women with long dark hair and shoot them. He chose a Charter Arms Bulldog .44 caliber revolver. The bullets it fired were enormous. They left wound channels the size of a closed fist. The first attack came in July of 1976 when he killed a young woman named Donna Loria as she sat in a car in the Bronx talking to a friend. He shot Donna once in the neck and once in the head. The friend, a woman named Jody Valenti, survived but would never walk normally again. Over the next 13 months, he attacked 7 more times. He killed 5 other people and wounded several. He preferred couples sitting in parked cars in residential neighborhoods. He would walk up out of the dark, shoot through the window, and walk away. He left taunting letters at scenes and mailed others to a New York Daily News columnist named Jimmy Breslin. He signed them Son of Sam. The letters were rambling, full of demonic imagery and references to the bloodthirsty dog. The city of New York lost its mind. Discotheques emptied, couples stopped parking, women cut their hair short and dyed it blonde. Mayor Abraham Beame held press conferences. The NYPD assembled the largest task force in its history and called it Operation Omega. They had nothing. By the end of July 1977, the killer's pattern had spread to Brooklyn for the first time. Late on the night of July 31st, a young woman named Stacy Moskowitz and her date Robert Violante parked their car near a street lamp at the corner of Bay 17th Street and Shore Parkway in the Gravesend section of Brooklyn. They had been on a first date. They had eaten dinner. They were sitting in the car talking. At about 2:45 in the morning, a man approached the passenger side, raised a pistol, and fired 4 rounds into the vehicle. Stacy was struck in the head. Robert was struck in the face. He survived, but lost most of the vision in both eyes. Stacy died the following afternoon at Kings County Hospital. She was 20 years old. There was a witness. Her name was Kaczynski Davis. She was a 49-year-old woman who lived nearby. And she had been walking her dog that night, just a few minutes before the shooting. She was returning home with the dog when she noticed something unusual. A police officer was writing a parking ticket. He was writing it for a cream-colored Ford Galaxy that had been parked too close to a fire hydrant near where Kaczynski was walking. The officer finished, slid the ticket under the windshield wiper, and drove off. A moment later, Kaczynski saw a man walking quickly with his arm tucked oddly inside his jacket. He passed her, glared at her, and continued on. She thought he looked strange. She did not know why. She went home. 4 minutes later, she heard the gunfire. For 2 weeks, Kaczynski Davis told no one. She was afraid. She had heard about the Son of Sam. She thought, what if this man saw me, and now he knows I saw him, and he is coming for me? Eventually, she told a friend, and the friend told a detective, and the detective took her statement. And on it, she described the strange man, and the parked car, and the police officer, and the parking ticket. The detective, a man named Joseph Strano, knew immediately that this was the most concrete lead any of them had received in 13 months. There was a piece of paper. A piece of paper meant a license plate. A license plate meant a name. Strano went to the Brooklyn Traffic Division. The clerks there pulled the records of every parking ticket issued in that part of Gravesend on the night of July 31st. There were 4 tickets within a few blocks of the murder. 3 of them belonged to local residents who could be quickly cleared. The 4th ticket had been written at 2:35 in the morning, 10 minutes before the shooting, for a cream-colored 1970 Ford Galaxy illegally parked next to a hydrant on Bay 17th Street. The car was registered to a David Berkowitz of 35 Pine Street, Yonkers, New York. The fine was $35. He had not paid it. The Yonkers police were contacted. They knew the name. Sam Carr, the man with the Labrador, had been complaining about a strange tenant in the neighborhood for months. There had been threatening letters about his dog. There had been a small fire set at Carr's house. The Yonkers detectives drove to 35 Pine Street on the afternoon of August 10, 1977, and they found the cream Galaxy parked on the street outside. They looked through the window. On the front seat, in plain view, lay a duffel bag. From the duffel bag protruded the wooden grip of a pistol. They waited. They did not move. They called for backup, and they waited. At 10 o'clock that night, David Berkowitz walked out of his apartment building carrying a paper bag. Inside the paper bag was the .44 caliber Bulldog revolver, fully loaded. He was on his way to commit another murder. He got into the Galaxy. The detectives moved in. They tapped on the window. He turned and looked at them and smiled and said, "Well, you got me." They asked him who he was. He said, "I'm Sam." The most feared man in New York City surrendered without firing a shot. He was caught for a $35 parking violation written by an officer he never saw, witnessed by a woman walking her dog, traced through a clerk's filing cabinet in the Brooklyn Traffic Division. Berkowitz pleaded guilty to all the killings in 1978 and received 6 consecutive 25 years to life sentences. He has been denied parole every time he has applied. The dog never spoke again. There was no demon. There never had been one. There was only an angry man with a pistol in a cream-colored car that was parked too close to a hydrant on the wrong night. Blackwell holds the original ticket. The carbon paper is brittle now. The handwriting of the officer is still legible. He used a blue pen. He pressed hard. He never knew that he had just written the most important document in the history of the New York Police Department. 6 dead, 7 wounded. 13 months of terror. Caught for $35. Now consider Timothy James McVeigh, April 19, 1995. Was a Wednesday. The morning was cool in Oklahoma City. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building stood 9 stories tall on Northwest 5th Street downtown, a glass and concrete federal office complex housing a Social Security office, a Department of Housing branch, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Regional Headquarters, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Secret Service, and on the 2nd floor, a daycare center named America's Kids, where federal employees dropped off their toddlers each morning before heading upstairs to their offices. At 9 o'clock that morning, the building was full. There were close to 600 people inside. There were 19 children in the daycare. They were singing. 2 minutes later, most of them were gone. A Rader rental truck, a yellow box truck with the rental company's logo on the sides, had been parked along the curb directly in front of the building. The driver had walked away minutes earlier. Inside the cargo area of the truck were 13 blue plastic barrels. Inside the barrels were 4,800 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer mixed with nitromethane racing fuel. Wired through the barrels was a length of detonating cord and 2 safety fuses cut to lengths the driver had measured carefully. The driver had lit the fuses at a stoplight 2 minutes before 9. He had parked the truck. He had locked the door. He had walked away. At 9:02, the entire north face of the Murrah building disappeared. The blast killed 168 people. 19 of them were children, 15 of them from the daycare on the 2nd floor. It wounded close to 700 others. It collapsed a third of the building into a crater 8 feet deep and 30 feet wide. The shockwave shattered windows in 300 buildings across 16 city blocks. It was, at that moment, the worst act of domestic terror in American history. The federal investigation that began within minutes of the explosion would eventually involve close to 1,000 FBI agents, the largest deployment of investigative resources since the Kennedy assassination. The agents would chase phantoms for weeks. They would interview witnesses about Middle Eastern men. They would issue international alerts. They would build composite sketches of foreign suspects. None of this mattered, because 78 miles north of Oklahoma City, on Interstate 35, just outside the small town of Perry, a state trooper named Charlie Hanger had already arrested the bomber. He had done it 88 minutes after the explosion. He had no idea who he had just arrested. Neither did anyone else for the next 2 days. Charlie Hanger was a veteran of the Oklahoma Highway Patrol. He was driving north on I-35 that morning in his marked patrol car. He was about 3 miles north of the Perry exit when he passed a yellow 1977 Mercury Marquis driving in the opposite lane. Something was wrong with the back of the car. He slowed. He looked again. The Mercury had no rear license plate. There was no plate at all. There was not even a temporary tag. The bumper was bare metal. Hanger turned his cruiser around, accelerated, and pulled the Mercury over. The driver was a thin young man, 26 years old, with a buzz cut and military bearing. He was wearing a black t-shirt that read "Sic Semper Tyrannis" on the front, the words spoken by John Wilkes Booth after he assassinated Abraham Lincoln. On the back, the shirt read, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." The driver handed Hanger a Michigan driver's license. The name on the license was Timothy James McVeigh. Hanger asked him about the missing plate. McVeigh said he had just bought the car and had not yet registered it. Hanger asked if there was a bill of sale in the vehicle. McVeigh said there was not. Hanger asked if he was carrying any weapons. McVeigh paused for a moment and said yes, he had a loaded handgun under his jacket. Hanger drew his own weapon, ordered McVeigh out of the car, and handcuffed him on the side of the highway. The pistol under McVeigh's jacket was a Glock 21 .45 caliber, fully loaded, with a hollow point round chambered. He was carrying a knife. He was carrying additional magazines of ammunition. The handgun was being carried concealed without a permit. That alone was enough to arrest him. Hanger transported him to the Noble County Jail in Perry and booked him for 4 offenses, the most serious of which was carrying a concealed weapon. None of the 4 offenses had anything to do with bombs. McVeigh was placed in a holding cell. He gave his real name. He gave his real address. He listed his current home as a farm in Decker, Michigan, owned by a friend named James Nichols. He was scheduled for an arraignment 2 days later before a county judge on the weapons charge. He was not flagged. He was not photographed by federal agents. He was simply another arrest in a small Oklahoma County jail. Meanwhile, in Oklahoma City, federal investigators sifting through the wreckage of the Rader truck had recovered the rear axle of the vehicle. It had been blown 2 blocks away. On the axle was stamped a vehicle identification number. The FBI traced the VIN to a Rader rental agency in Junction City, Kansas. Agents flew there within hours. The clerk at the rental office gave a description of the man who had rented the truck 2 days earlier under the alias Robert Kling. A composite sketch was drawn. The agents canvassed every motel in Junction City. At a small motel called the Dreamland, a clerk named Leah McGowan recognized the sketch. She said the man had stayed there. She said his real name was Timothy McVeigh. She had it written in her register book. The FBI ran the name through the National Crime Database that night. The database returned a hit. Timothy James McVeigh was already in custody. He was sitting in a holding cell in Perry, Oklahoma, awaiting arraignment on a weapons charge. He had been there for 2 days. The judge in Noble County was about to release him on bond when a federal marshal walked into the courtroom and quietly handed the judge a note. The judge looked at it, looked up at McVeigh, and ordered him remanded. The arraignment was halted. McVeigh was transferred to federal custody within the hour. He never expressed regret. He referred to the children in the daycare as collateral damage. He was tried in Denver, convicted on all 11 counts, and sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection on June 11, 2001, at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He chose William Ernest Henley's poem Invictus as his final statement. He left no apology. He left no explanation. There was nothing left of him to explain. He had planned the bombing for 2 years. He had selected the target based on architectural blueprints he had studied. He had rented the truck under a false name. He had paid in cash. He had built the bomb using techniques from a survivalist novel called The Turner Diaries, which he carried around with him. He had taken every precaution a domestic terrorist could take. And then he had driven away from the bomb in a car with no license plate. That is the detail that ends his story. Not the manifesto, not the fertilizer, not the timer. A piece of yellow rectangular tin that costs $5 to install and would have made him invisible. He did not bother. He thought he was already gone. Blackwell keeps the impound report from the Mercury Marquis. There is a small notation on the second page. Rear plate area. No plate observed, no screws, no mounting bracket damage. Vehicle had not had a plate for at least several days prior to stop. He had been driving without one the entire time he was building the bomb. 168 people, 19 children. The largest federal manhunt in modern memory, caught by a state trooper for a missing piece of stamped metal. Now consider Theodore John Kaczynski. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt track in the Scapegoat Wilderness near Lincoln, Montana, at an elevation of about 5,600 feet. It was 10 feet by 12 feet, made of rough planks, with a single window and no electricity, no plumbing, no telephone. It had a small wood stove for heat. It had a desk, a bunk, and a tin can full of pencils. The man who lived in it had been there since June of 1971. He had built the cabin himself out of materials he hauled in by hand. His name was Ted Kaczynski, and he had once been one of the most promising mathematicians in the United States. He had entered Harvard at 16. He had received a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Michigan. His dissertation had been so dense that one of his examiners said only 10 or 12 people in the country could understand it. He had taken a tenure-track job at the University of California at Berkeley at 25. 2 years later, he resigned without explanation, drove to Montana, and never returned. For more than 2 decades, he lived alone in that cabin, growing vegetables, hunting rabbits, reading philosophy, and building bombs. The bombs began arriving in 1978. The first one was a wrapped package left in a parking lot at the University of Illinois at Chicago, addressed to a professor at Northwestern. The package was returned to the listed sender, who opened it and was injured. Over the next 17 years, 16 more bombs followed. They went to airline executives, to computer scientists, to advertising consultants, to a forestry official in California, to a tenured professor at Yale. 3 people were killed. 23 were wounded, some maimed. The FBI assigned the case the code name Unabomber, an acronym for University and Airline Bomber. The investigation became the longest and most expensive in the history of the Bureau, costing over $50 million and consuming the working hours of more than 150 agents at its peak. They had nothing. The bombs were handmade with materials any person could buy at a hardware store. They contained no fingerprints. The wood used in some of the casings was hand-carved. Untraceable. There was no consistent target profile that could narrow the suspect pool. The bomber communicated only occasionally through letters mailed from random Western post offices. The agents knew only that the bomber was meticulous, intelligent, white, male, probably middle-aged, and probably living somewhere in the Mountain West. That description matched several million people. Then in June of 1995, the bomber sent a letter to the New York Times. It contained an offer. He had written a manifesto. It was 35,000 words long. It was titled Industrial Society and Its Future. If a major American newspaper published it in full, he would stop sending bombs. If they refused, he would continue. The Times consulted with the Washington Post and with the Department of Justice. Attorney General Janet Reno and FBI Director Louis Freeh recommended publication. They believed someone, somewhere, would read the manifesto and recognize the writing. On September 19, 1995, the Washington Post published the entire manuscript as an 8-page supplement, with the New York Times sharing the printing costs. Millions of copies were distributed. In a Schenectady, New York suburb, a man named David Kaczynski was handed a copy of the supplement by his wife, Linda Patrick. Linda had been suspicious for months. She had read newspaper accounts of the Unabomber's writing style, and something in those accounts had reminded her of David's older brother Ted, the strange recluse in Montana whom no one in the family had seen in years. She begged David to read the manifesto. He resisted at first. The idea was unthinkable. Ted was difficult, withdrawn, paranoid. But he was a brother. A brother could not be that. David read the manifesto. By the second page, he was uneasy. By the fifth page, he was nauseated. The phrases were familiar. The cadence was familiar. The use of certain unusual constructions, the precise way the writer assembled philosophical arguments, the hostility toward modern technology that he remembered from family dinners decades earlier. He went to the attic of his mother Wanda's home in the suburbs of Chicago and pulled down boxes of Ted's old letters from the early 1970s. The letters his brother had written to their mother just after he moved to Montana. He spread them on the dining room table and compared them to the manifesto, sentence by sentence. The matches were not exact. Ted was careful. He had varied his vocabulary. He had altered certain spellings, used British spellings in some places, American in others, to throw off analysts. But the underlying structure was unmistakable. There were specific phrases. One line in the manifesto referred to people who tried to behave as though they could eat their cake and have it too. The unusual reversal of the standard idiom, "eat your cake and have it," instead of "have your cake and eat it," appeared verbatim in a letter Ted had written in 1971. David did the hardest thing a human being can do. He told his wife. They agreed to contact the FBI. They hired an attorney named Anthony Bisegli in Washington to act as an intermediary. They asked only that the FBI not use the death penalty against Ted if he were convicted. The Bureau would not promise this, but they accepted the information. Linguistic analysts at Quantico compared the letters to the manifesto and confirmed an extremely high probability of common authorship. On the morning of April 3, 1996, federal agents in winter coats walked up the dirt track to the cabin in Lincoln, Montana. They knocked. Ted Kaczynski opened the door. He was 43 years old. He had not bathed in some time. The agents took him into custody without resistance. Inside the cabin, they found a finished bomb, wrapped and ready to mail, with a target's name written on the package. They found tens of thousands of pages of journals in which he had documented every detail of every attack. They found typewriters whose typeface matched the manifesto. They found his original handwritten draft. He pleaded guilty in 1998 to avoid a death sentence. He received 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He died at a federal medical facility in North Carolina in June of 2023. 3 dead, 23 wounded, 17 years, $50 million. Caught by his own brother because of a sentence about cake. David Kaczynski has spoken publicly many times in the years since. He has been thanked by victims' families. He has been condemned by some who believe a brother should never inform on a brother. He himself has said that he had no choice. He believes Ted would have killed again. He believes the manifesto was an instrument of identification, placed in the world for that exact purpose, by a brother whose mind, somewhere beneath the obsession, may have wanted to be stopped. Blackwell holds a photocopy of the Washington Post supplement. It is on tabloid Nooneyes, the sound of his own voice. He lost that bet by 1 sentence. Now consider Joseph James DeAngelo. For decades in California, there was a man who had no name. The state's law enforcement agencies knew him by a series of titles given to him by terrified communities. In Visalia, in 1974 and 75, he was the Visalia ransacker, a burglar who broke into homes and stole strange, small things, single earrings, photographs, dimes. In Sacramento, beginning in 1976, he became the East Area Rapist, breaking into bedrooms in the dead of night. By 1979, he had moved south, and in Goleta and Ventura and Irvine and Dana Point, he became the original Night Stalker. He killed people in their beds. By the time he stopped, in 1986, he had committed at least 13 confirmed killings, more than 50 home invasions, and more than 100 burglaries. Then he simply disappeared for over 30 years. The investigation crossed jurisdictions in a way no California case ever had. By the late 1990s, detectives had established through DNA that the Visalia ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and the original Night Stalker were the same man. Author Michelle McNamara, in a series of articles and later in a book published posthumously in 2018, gave him the name by which most of the country now knows him. She called him the Golden State Killer. She died in 2016, before the case was solved, while still working on her manuscript. Her husband completed it. The case was reopened by an investigator named Paul Holes, a forensic scientist who had worked on it for 2 decades and was nearing retirement. He had a single resource the original detectives never had. In the late 1970s, when the killings began, the only thing recovered from the scenes was biological evidence, in tubes, frozen, sealed. By 2017, those tubes could be sequenced into a full genetic profile. Holes had the killer's complete DNA. He had no name to put with it. The conventional approach was to compare the profile to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, the federal database of convicted offenders. He had done this many times over the years. There was no match. The killer had never been arrested for anything that resulted in a database entry. He was outside the system. In April of 2017, a colleague of Holes mentioned a website called GEDmatch. It was a free, public, open-source genealogy site used primarily by hobbyists tracing family trees. Users uploaded their own DNA profiles generated from commercial kits like 23andMe or Ancestry, and the site would match them with distant relatives also using the service. The matches it produced were not direct identifications. They were second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, often people the user had never heard of who shared common ancestors generations back. Holes uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch under a false identity. He waited. The site returned several distant matches. None of them were the killer. They were strangers who shared a small percentage of their genome with the man who had terrorized California for 12 years. Holes assembled a team of genealogists. They began building family trees backward from each match, identifying the common ancestors, then constructing the descendants forward in time, generation by generation, looking for individuals who would have been the right age, the right gender, in the right places at the right times. It took 4 months. The trees pointed eventually to a single man. He was 72 years old. He lived in a small house in Citrus Heights, a Sacramento suburb. He was a retired truck mechanic. Decades earlier, he had been a police officer in 2 small California towns. Fired in 1979 after he was caught shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer from a pharmacy. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. Investigators began watching the house. They needed his actual DNA to confirm the match. They could not obtain it openly without alerting him. Instead, they followed him. They waited until he discarded something, a tissue, a cup, a swab from a car door handle that he touched. The samples were tested. The match was perfect. On April 24, 2018, officers approached him as he stepped out of his house in the late afternoon. He did not resist. He was 72. He looked tired. He said nothing significant. He was placed in a wheelchair for his court appearances. He pleaded guilty in 2020 to 13 counts of murder and dozens of related charges. He received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He died in custody in August of 2024. He had been a police officer. He had attended forensic seminars. He had read newspaper accounts of his own crimes. He had retired into anonymous suburban life and grown old planting tomatoes in his backyard. He had not committed a known crime in 32 years. He had, by every external measure, escaped. And then he was destroyed by a website used by people who wanted to know whether their grandfather really came from County Cork. Blackwell keeps a printout of the original GEDmatch family tree assembled by Holes and his team. It looks like an organizational chart for a mid-sized company. There are little circles for each person. The names are in standard typeface. At the bottom of one branch, circled in red pen, are the words DeAngelo, Joseph James. He had no idea the day he died how many of his great-great cousins had submitted their saliva to a website for fun. 13 confirmed killings, more than 50 home invasions, 40 years of escape. caught by genealogy hobbyists who had never heard his name. Now consider Dennis Lynn Rader. Park City, Kansas is a small suburb of Wichita with a population of about 7,000 people. In the early 2000s, it was the kind of town where everyone knew the city compliance officer. A polite, middle-aged man named Dennis Rader, who measured front yards to make sure the grass was not too tall and issued citations to people whose dogs ran off-leash. He was the president of the church council at Christ Lutheran Church. He had been a Cub Scout leader. He had been a precinct committeeman. He had a wife named Paula and 2 adult children. He was, by every visible standard, the most ordinary man in Sedgwick County. He was also the man known to the police for 31 years as BTK. The acronym stood for words he had given himself. He had begun using it in letters he sent to local newspapers and television stations in the 1970s, taking credit for a series of killings in and around Wichita that had begun in 1974. The first attack had wiped out most of a single family. Over the following decade and a half, he had killed at least 10 people, men and women and children. He bound them, immobilized them, strangled them. He took photographs of their belongings. He kept trophies. After each killing, he would send police a long, taunting communication, sometimes mailed to a TV station, sometimes left in a public location and called in. He included poems, sketches, and fragments of victims' identification. He demanded recognition. He wanted a name. He gave himself one. The newspapers printed it. Then in 1991, he stopped. The communications ceased. The killings ceased. For 13 years, there was nothing. The Wichita Police Department continued to work the case as a cold file. They assumed the killer was either dead or in prison for another offense. They could not have imagined that he was a city employee 3 suburbs over, attending church board meetings. In March of 2004, a Wichita newspaper, the Wichita Eagle, published a retrospective on the 30th anniversary of the first BTK killing. The article suggested the killer was probably gone. 2 weeks later, the newspaper received a letter. It contained a photocopy of a victim's driver's license that had never been recovered and 3 Polaroid photographs of a body that had never been publicly seen. The handwriting was instantly recognizable to detectives who had worked the original case. He was back. He had been silent for 13 years, and the newspaper had insulted him by suggesting he had ended. What followed was almost a year of communications. He sent 11 separate packages to police, to media outlets, to anonymous drop locations he specified by phone. The packages contained writing, drawings, word puzzles, items related to old killings, and items he claimed related to potential new ones. He played a game with the Wichita police that he believed he was winning. In one package, he asked, directly in writing, whether he could communicate with police via floppy disk. He wanted to know whether such a disk could be traced back to him. The police responded through a newspaper classified ad. They said no, a floppy disk could not be traced. He could safely communicate that way. This was a lie. The police had consulted with computer forensic specialists. They knew that a floppy disk could be rich with identifying metadata, embedded in any file created with modern word processing software. They knew that documents created in Microsoft Word from the late 1990s forward stored the username of the registered software owner, the path of the file's location on the original computer, the date and time of creation, and frequently, the name of any organization the software was registered to. They told him the lie deliberately. They waited. In February of 2005, a small purple floppy disk arrived at a Wichita television station. It was packaged with other materials he had sent. The disk contained a single Word document. A computer forensic technician at the Wichita Police Department inserted it into a laboratory machine and examined the metadata fields. There were 2 pieces of information embedded in the file properties. The author's first name was listed as Dennis. The path information showed that the document had been last saved on a computer registered to Christ Lutheran Church. The detectives drove to the Christ Lutheran Church in Park City within the hour. They asked the office staff who, among the church's volunteer leadership, was named Dennis. The staff said the church council president was named Dennis Rader. They gave the detectives his address. The detectives ran his name through every law enforcement database they had access to. They learned that he had a daughter named Carrie Rader, that she had attended Kansas State University, and that during her time there, she had voluntarily submitted to a routine medical procedure at the campus clinic. There was a pap smear sample preserved in the University Medical Archive. The detectives obtained a court order. They ran the daughter's DNA against the male DNA recovered decades earlier from BTK crime scenes. The results showed a familial match consistent with a father-daughter relationship. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was driving home from his city compliance job in Park City when officers pulled him over near his house. He was in a city vehicle. He was wearing his uniform polo shirt with the city seal embroidered on the chest. He surrendered without resistance. He smiled at the officers. He seemed almost relieved. He said only one sentence on the side of the road that became famous in the case files. He said, "Hey, I have a feeling I know what this is about." He confessed in extraordinary detail over the following days. He explained the planning behind each killing in clinical terms, as if he were narrating a hobby. He used the word projects to describe his crimes. He had stored evidence of them in plastic tubs in his garage and in storage units around Wichita. The investigators recovered drawings, journals, photographs, victim items, and homemade publications he had assembled to document his own work, bound in cheap plastic covers like school reports. He pleaded guilty in June of 2005 and received 10 consecutive life sentences. The sentencing hearing took most of a day. He read aloud in court his own clinical descriptions of each killing. The families of his victims sat in the gallery and listened. The judge, when it was finally his turn to speak, told Rader that he hoped he would have many decades to think about what he had said in that courtroom. Rader is alive at this writing in El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, serving sentences that will keep him there until he dies. He had killed for 17 years and taunted the police for 31. He had survived computer technology entirely, having committed his crimes and built his persona in an era of typewriters and mail. And then, after the world had nearly forgotten him, he asked the police whether they could trace a floppy disk. They said no. He believed them. He sent the disk. The disk contained a checkbox in a software properties window that he had never thought to uncheck. 2 pieces of metadata: a first name, a church. Blackwell keeps a printed screenshot of the file properties dialog from that document. It shows the standard Microsoft Office layout of the era. Author, Dennis. Last saved by, Dennis. Path, C, / Documents and settings, / Christ Lutheran Church. 3 lines of text. They ended a man whom 30 years of police work had not been able to touch. 10 dead. 3 decades of taunting. Caught by a checkbox. Now consider Larry William Eyler. Interstate 65 runs north and south from the Gulf Coast of Alabama through Tennessee and Kentucky and Indiana and into Chicago. Interstate 70 runs east and west from Maryland to Utah, slicing through the agricultural heart of the Midwest. The 2 highways cross in central Indiana. In the early 1980s, in a corridor of farmland and rest stops along these 2 roads, the bodies of young men began to appear. They were left in cornfields and ditches and on the shoulders of access roads. They had been bound. They had been killed by hand, with a knife, in ways that suggested ritualized violence. They were teenagers, drifters, hitchhikers, young men who picked up rides from strangers in the days when picking up rides from strangers was still ordinary. By 1983, the count of bodies linked to a single suspected killer had passed a dozen. By the spring of 1984, it stood at 19. By that summer, it stood at 21. The investigation crossed jurisdictions in 4 states. Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, and Wisconsin all had open cases. There was a multi-agency task force operating out of Indianapolis. The investigators developed a leading suspect. His name was Larry Eyler. He was a 32-year-old house painter from Greencastle, Indiana, with a long history of arrests for low-level offenses and a documented pattern of cruising highway truck stops looking for young men. He had been questioned. He had been polygraphed. He had been put under intermittent surveillance. There was circumstantial evidence connecting him to multiple scenes. There was no proof. In September of 1983, he had been arrested in Lowell, Indiana, after a state trooper found him at a rest area with a young man and a length of rope and a hunting knife. Charges had been filed. A judge had thrown out the evidence on procedural grounds related to the search of his pickup truck. He had walked free. The killings had continued through the spring and summer of the next year. The task force was overwhelmed and out of options. The local press had begun referring to the suspect as the highway killer. There were public warnings to young men. There were billboards. On the night of August 30th, 1984, in Lake Forest, Illinois, a wealthy suburb of Chicago located near Lake Michigan, an officer named Kenneth Beerley was on routine patrol. Lake Forest was not the kind of town where one expected serial killings to be solved. It was a community of estates and country clubs. Beerley was driving past a small commercial parking lot behind an apartment building. He noticed a pickup truck parked in the lot. The truck was not local. He noticed two figures next to it. One of them was an adult man, tall and lanky, in his 30s. The other was a teenage boy, blonde, slight, much younger. The two were standing very close together near the rear of the truck. The boy looked uneasy. The man had his hand on the boy's shoulder in a way that did not look casual. Beerley pulled into the lot. He approached. He asked them what they were doing. The man identified himself as Larry Eyler of Greencastle, Indiana. The boy identified himself as a 15-year-old runaway named Daryl Hayward. He said Eyler had picked him up hitchhiking on the interstate that afternoon and had brought him here. The boy was visibly relieved at the appearance of the officer. Beerley asked Eyler if he could look in the truck. Eyler said yes. He had no reason to refuse. He believed. He had walked away from a search before. He thought he could do it again. Inside the truck, Beerley found rope. He found duct tape. He found a hunting knife. He found a length of plastic sheeting. He found stains. He took Eyler into custody and turned him over to detectives within the hour. The pickup was impounded. A forensic team went over it inch by inch. The blood and fiber evidence recovered from that single search would, over the following weeks, link Eyler to multiple killings spread across 4 states. The boy he had picked up that afternoon, Daryl Hayward, never knew until much later how close he had come. Eyler was charged in Illinois with the killing of a young man named Daniel McNeve, whose body had been found earlier that summer. He was convicted in 1986 and sentenced to death. While on death row, he gave detailed confessions to 20 additional killings, bringing his confirmed total to 21. He named accomplices in some of the cases, including a former university professor in Indiana, whom he claimed had assisted him with at least one killing. He died in prison of complications from AIDS in March of 1994, before his death sentence could be carried out. The case is one of the most extensively documented serial offender investigations in Midwestern law enforcement history. He had been hunting on the open road for years. He had been arrested before and walked. He had been polygraphed and beaten the test. He had read newspaper accounts of his own work and continued. And in the end, he was caught, not by the multi-state task force assembled to find him, not by the dozens of detectives in 4 states pursuing his case, but by a single municipal officer in a wealthy lakefront suburb who happened to drive past a parking lot at the right moment and decided that the body language between 2 people standing next to a pickup truck did not look right. 21 young men, 2 interstate highways, 4 states. Caught because Officer Beerley saw a posture and trusted his eye. Blackwell keeps a copy of the Lake Forest Police Department incident report from that night. It is 1 page long. It describes the parking lot, the truck, the two individuals, and the conversation. It is written in the flat, declarative prose of police paperwork. There is no dramatic language in it. The most important sentence is short. Officer observed adult subject in close physical proximity to apparent juvenile. Subject's body language inconsistent with normal adult-juvenile interaction. Officer approached to investigate. That is how a serial killer ends. Not in a stakeout, not in a chase. In a paragraph written by a beat cop on a Thursday night. 6 killers, 6 accidents. The pattern is unmistakable. Berkowitz parked too close to a hydrant. McVeigh drove without a license plate. Kaczynski mailed his own confession to the largest reading public on Earth. DeAngelo could not predict that grandchildren of his great-great cousins would one day spit in tubes and upload their genomes for fun. Rader asked the police to lie to him and was deeply satisfied when they obliged. Eyler stood in a parking lot in a posture that any honest adult would have known to avoid. In each case, the investigative apparatus that should have caught these men, by every conventional theory of how policing is supposed to work, had failed. Operation Omega had 300 detectives and produced nothing. The FBI's Unabomber task force burned $50 million and produced nothing. The Sacramento Sheriff's Department had spent decades on the East Area rapist case and was no closer to a name in 2017 than they had been in 1978. The Wichita Police Department had a shelf of files on BTK, and an entire generation of officers retired without solving it. The Highway Killer Task Force had files on Eyler before he was finally arrested and could not make the case. It was not the apparatus that caught these men. The apparatus is large, slow, and bureaucratic. It produces volume, but rarely produces resolution. What caught these men was something the apparatus cannot manufacture. Each of them was caught by a small, ordinary citizen or a single, low-ranking employee of a small institution who happened to be in the right place at the right time and who had the patience or luck or honest eye to notice something. A meter cop, a state trooper, a brother, a genealogy hobbyist, a police computer technician with a forensic checklist, a municipal patrolman in a wealthy suburb. There is a particular pattern to how they were caught, and it is worth pausing on because it tells you something true about the world. None of these men were caught by their own criminal acts. They were caught by what they did between criminal acts, by how they parked, by how they drove, by what they wrote in letters home before they were criminals at all, by what their relatives shared at family reunions, by the metadata in software they trusted, by the way they stood next to another human being in a parking lot. Each of them, in the moment of detection, was not committing a crime. They were doing something that, on the surface, looked legal, normal, mundane. Berkowitz had finished his attack and was walking away. McVeigh had already driven for an hour past the bombing. Kaczynski had been quiet for months between bombs. DeAngelo had been retired for 30 years. Rader had been silent for 13 years before the newspaper article reawakened his vanity. Eyler had not yet harmed the boy in his truck. The crime, in each case, was already committed or had not yet begun. What betrayed them was the texture of their lives in between. The everyday minute when they thought they were not on stage. That is the lesson that runs through every page of every one of these files. There is no such thing anywhere in the historical record as a perfect criminal. There is only a criminal who has not yet made his ordinary mistake. The genius killer of magazine fiction does not exist outside of magazine fiction. The killer who plots for years and outwits the system is, when you read the actual investigative documents, almost always a man who paid 40 cents at a vending machine and dropped his receipt and was traced by it. The intelligence and patience that builds the fantasy of the unstoppable predator is overwhelmed, in every case, by the small clumsiness of being an ordinary embodied human who has to drive cars and write letters and stand in parking lots and check boxes in software and have brothers and have second cousins. It is comforting in a strange way to know this. Children of the late 20th century grew up on a media culture in which the serial killer was nearly mythic, a kind of dark superhuman who walked through the legal system as if invisible. Movies, novels, true crime cable, a whole industry built around the idea that some criminals were simply too brilliant to catch. The reality contained in the file boxes I keep is much smaller. The reality is that the most feared men of the late 20th century were felled by parking tickets, missing license plates, family resemblance in prose, public genealogy websites, default settings in word processing software, and a single moment of bad body language in a suburban parking lot. There is a related lesson, equally important, about who actually solves crimes. The American public imagines, because of how cases are reported, that crimes are solved by detectives. The detective is the heroic figure of the genre. He stands in front of a corkboard. He drinks coffee at 3 in the morning. He has a hunch. He follows the hunch. He creates old letters spread out on a dining room table. From a forensic technician examining a Word document, from a beat cop on routine patrol. The detective's role is to receive the break, recognize it, document it, and move on it. That is the actual job. It is an honorable job. It is not the job of the genre. The most consequential character in the Berkowitz case was Cecilia Davis walking her dog. She did not carry a badge. She had not been trained. She had no obligation to come forward. She came forward late and reluctantly, but she came forward. The most consequential character in the McVeigh case was Charlie Hanger, a state trooper riding a routine traffic citation 78 miles from the bombing. The most consequential character in the Kaczynski case was David Kaczynski, a brother in a suburban attic who did the hardest thing a brother can do. The most consequential character in the DeAngelo case was Paul Holes, but Holes himself would tell you that the actual key to the case was not him. It was the nameless great-great cousin who, years earlier, had spit into a tube and clicked yes on a terms of service agreement. The most consequential character in the BTK case was an unnamed forensic technician at the Wichita Police Department who knew where to look in a software properties dialog. The most consequential character in the Eyler case was Officer Kenneth Burley in Lake Forest, Illinois. These are small names. They are not the names that appear in book titles. They will not be remembered the way the killers will be remembered. That is one of the perversities of the genre. It is also why I keep these files, because somebody should remember them. There is a third lesson, the one I find hardest to put into words, but the one I think matters most. It is about what kind of mistake each of these men made, and what those mistakes reveal about the inner condition of the criminal mind. Berkowitz parked illegally because he thought he was important enough to break a small rule. McVeigh drove without a license plate because he wanted, on some level, to be conspicuous, to be defiant, to express through the bareness of his bumper a contempt for the federal system he was about to attack. Kaczynski sent his manifesto to the largest possible audience because he wanted to be read. He wanted his ideas to be acknowledged. He wanted, beneath the 17 years of careful concealment, to be known. The act of mailing the manifesto was the act of a man who could no longer bear to be invisible. DeAngelo was arrogant in his retirement. He had stopped killing for 30 years and believed that his restraint had earned him permanent escape. He could not have foreseen the development of consumer genetic testing, because that development would have required him to imagine a future in which ordinary people would willingly catalog their own DNA for entertainment. He thought the future would look like the past. Rader directly asked the police to confirm his safety. He could not bear the silence of his 13-year hiatus, and he reawakened his correspondence specifically to extend it. He believed the police were less intelligent than he was. He could not conceive that they might lie to him. Eyler stood in a parking lot with a teenage boy whose body language he failed to read because he believed, by that point in his career, yet he was untouchable on the open road. In every case, the mistake was not technical. The technical errors were merely the surface. The underlying error was always pride. Each of these men had become, by the time of their capture, certain of their own escape. They had built up so many years of evading the system that they had begun to believe the system could not see them. They had stopped imagining the system as a real thing. They had begun to imagine it as a stupid older relative who could be to maintain it. He relaxes. He parks too close to the hydrant. He forgets the license plate. He sends in the manifesto. He uploads the metadata. He stands in the parking lot. The system, which has been waiting all along, closes its hand. That is what these 6 files teach you. They teach you that the mind which has fooled the world for years eventually fools itself. They teach you that the hardest enemy the criminal faces is not the FBI or the local detective. It is his own slowly accumulating belief that he is exceptional. That belief is fatal. It is fatal in every case. It is fatal at $35 in a Brooklyn precinct ledger and fatal at $50 million in a federal bureau budget. It does not matter the scale. I think about Cecilia Davis sometimes. She was a 40-ish Austrian immigrant in Brooklyn. She walked her dog. She saw a man and she did not feel right about him. She told no one for 13 days because she was afraid. Then she told a friend. Then she told a detective. Then she told the truth. And because of her, 6 people who had not yet been killed were not killed. And Stacy Moskowitz was the last. I think about David Kaczynski sometimes. He was an ordinary man with an ordinary job and a family and a brother he loved. He read 8 pages of newsprint. He climbed into his mother's attic. He spread old letters on a dining room table. He compared sentences. And then he made a phone call he did not want to make, to lawyers he did not want to hire, who passed information to agents he did not want to talk to, all in order to save people he would never meet. I think about Charlie Hanger sometimes. He was a trooper on a quiet stretch of interstate on a Wednesday morning. He saw a missing license plate. He turned around. He did the small, ordinary thing that he had done thousands of times in his career. And he saved, by that small, ordinary act, the lives of every additional person Timothy McVeigh might have killed in a country whose national security apparatus had not yet realized he existed. These are the people who actually catch killers. They are not famous. They do not sign books. They do not appear on cable. They are, almost without exception, ordinary human beings doing their actual job or living their actual life with their eyes open. 6 killers, 6 accidents, none of them caught by genius, all of them caught by themselves, with the help of someone whose name will not be remembered. This is the history I keep. The cabinet of small papers, the cabinet of small humans, the $35 ticket in Glassine, the traffic stop report from Perry, Oklahoma, the 8-page Washington Post supplement, the GEDmatch family tree printout, the screenshot of a Microsoft Office Properties dialogue, the 1-page incident report from Lake Forest, Illinois, 6 pieces of paper that ended 6 empires of fear. If there is a moral here, it is this. Watch how the small things are done. Watch how the cars are parked. Watch how the licenses are filled out. Watch how the letters are written. Watch how the metadata is set. Watch how the people stand next to other people in parking lots. The criminal mind, the truly dangerous criminal mind, is nearly always tripped up not by what it considers important, but by what it considers beneath its notice. The rear bumper, the carbon copy, the default checkbox, the body language in a public space, the genealogical impulse of distant relatives toward family history. These are the things by which empires fall. I keep the files. I read them again at long intervals. I never tire of how unspectacular each ending was. The son of Sam, surrendering at his car on Pine Street with a paper bag in his lap. The Oklahoma City bomber, sitting in a county jail in Perry on a weapons charge while the FBI chased phantoms in Tulsa. The Unabomber, opening the cabin door without resistance to agents standing in winter coats. the Golden State Killer, a tired old man being approached as he stepped out of his garage. BTK, in his city compliance uniform on the side of a Park City road, smiling and saying that he had a feeling he knew what this was about. The highway killer, in a parking lot in Lake Forest, with a teenage boy beside him, whom he never harmed because Officer Burley drove past at the right moment. None of them put up a fight. None of them ran. By the time the small, ordinary mistake had been recognized for what it was, the run was already over. They had been running for years inside a maze whose walls were made of their own arrogance. The walls closed when they were ready to close. The runner was, at the end, exhausted. Some of them, like Rader, were almost glad. The ones who had taunted longest were often the ones who, at the moment of capture, looked the most relieved. That is not a sentimental observation. It is a clinical one. The mind that builds the maze cannot sustain itself indefinitely against the pressure of secrecy. The maze is metabolically expensive. It costs the mind something to run inside it. Eventually, the mind wants to be free of it. The arrogance is a symptom of that wanting. The mistake is the form the wanting takes. In every case, the killer did not so much get caught as catch himself. He extended his foot and tripped over it. There are dozens of other cases I could have included tonight. I chose these 6 because each represents a different category of accident: civic, vehicular, linguistic, genetic, digital, postural. Together they cover, as far as I can tell, the entire catalog of how legendary criminals are actually undone. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you doubt that ordinary observation matters, that ordinary diligence matters, that ordinary honesty matters, I want you to remember the meter cop in Brooklyn at 2:30 in the morning, who never received a medal, who never had his picture in the paper, who simply wrote the ticket because the car was parked next to a hydrant. Remember the trooper on I-35 who saw a bare bumper and turned around? Remember the brother in the attic with the letters? Remember the technician with the floppy disk? Remember the patrolman who did not like the look of 2 figures in a parking lot? These were not heroes by their own measure. They were people doing the small piece of their work that was given to them. The world saved itself in each of these 6 cases through them. I am Blackwell. I keep the files. I tell the stories. I do not glorify the killers. I do not believe they deserve glorification. I tell their stories because their stories, properly told, are the stories of the people who caught them, and those people deserve to be remembered. 6 killers, 6 accidents, 1 $35 parking ticket, 1 missing.